Good morning, everyone. Welcome back to the channel. It's just after 5 a.m. on October 6, 2024, and my friend Dakota and I are driving east towards the S-Line that I know all of y'all are now very familiar with. When we do these Saturday runs up the old seaboard, we usually start at Vitus Junction, but hearing a train clear the junction as we came into Zephyr Hills, we headed a few miles south on US 301 into Knights along the Yeoman Sub. Seeing greens at the north end of Knights siding, we'd pull into the next road crossing where an ethanol train would be tied down. If it's loaded, that's the light of the N-train DPU, but if it's empty, that's the light of a long hood-forward ES40 DC, which I guess has led the train here. Our train coming south would be M441, speeding south towards Plant City just before 6 a.m., seen here at track speed along the perfectly straight section of this trackage. Over the past few months, 441 has been a guaranteed night run around here, with the rare exception of delays up north resulting in a daylight appearance once every couple of months. In June, this was a midnight train, and now it's an early morning train. Perhaps the days of sunrise runs are approaching again, but that's just a hope. 441's racks bound for Drew Park would wrap up his long string of freight for Yeoman and send us packing back north along 301 towards Vitus, Dade City, and Bushnell. 45 minutes later, we're exiting off of I-75 at Wildwood and driving into town. Back in its seaboard days, Wildwood was a hub for freight and passenger traffic alike, drawing crowds to the station which by extension filled up the downtown area. Stores from its heyday are still around, now preparing for a new life with Wildwood's downtown project. The main street parking garage already constructed and complete, Wildwood plans to create a block called the Rail Yard where restaurants and eateries will host visitors parked downtown, or walkers and bikers off the linear trail, another project that will parallel the yard here. I'm not sure how much of this construction will affect the shots here between fences and limited space due to the construction, but it is sure nice to see a revamp coming to this classic Florida town. For now, construction gets the day off on Saturday, but not the crew of M457, southbound freight cruising down the S-Line for Taft Yard in Orlando. Like the M441 from earlier, 457 would be mostly loaded auto racks, making up about 2/3 of the consist today, trailing behind the first 2,500 feet of manifest freight. Nothing would be to follow 457 into Wildwood, so we'd push north again, ending up in Ocala, in Florida Northern's Magnolia Street Terminal, where the short line would be beginning their day. Engines 1802 and 4603 would be already online and idling when we'd arrive, notable for their two very different paint conditions, both Florida Northern colors though. The former, number 1802, is a rebuilt Jeep 11 built way back in 1957 for the Illinois Central as number 9341. Crazy to think that this good-looking 4-axle is still cooking after 67 years on the job. The trailing engine, Jeep 10 4603, is 11 months older than the 1802, however it's been due for a new paint job for quite some time now. Unfortunately for us, the crew today would have an easy shift of switching their yard here and taking cars to Anderson, Columbia, two operations hidden from the public eye and not very desirable anyways. So we'd move back to the S-Line about a mile north of the Diamond and the depot to 8th Avenue. Located at milepost S734.5, 8th Avenue is the mainline crossover in the Ocala double track and the location of the third signal cantilever in the area. Locals up from Wildwood are always a sure sight around here, as this is where they'll usually run around their train, or they're working one of 3 industries served by the spur that breaks off track 1 at the crossover. This morning there'd be a high green for another southbound, calling as our old friend M453, heading south today led by one of CSX's rebuilt SD70s, a welcome sight amidst the monotony of GE motors. Continuing the trend today, 453 would also be mostly auto racks, and a lot of them, over 80 actually. Not too much manifest freight, but nothing out of the ordinary. With scrap, boxcars, and cement hoppers from Miami, remember all of this train's rock traffic is still taken care of by the L743 and L729 pair to Winston, and local 793 and L792 from there to Miami.
Good morning, everybody. It is 10:54 a.m. and we are at the Lake Weir Avenue crossing in Ocala. Now behind me is the Ocala defect detector and distant to Santos signal. We're waiting on a WO89 coming north. He just met 453 in Santos, the one we saw up at 8th Avenue. So he should be here in maybe 3 minutes. I guess we'll see.
This would be my first time seeing one of these trains, fully made up of Herzog-Dallas cars on the S-Line. Like I mentioned in my last video, it feels a little bit early for CSX to be running stuff like these work trains before the holidays and before the weather cools down, but I'm not one to complain, as it's another S-Line train, and a pretty cool one at that.
Detector, milepost 739.7, no defects. Repeat, no defects. Total axles 284. Detector out.
Around this time, we'd hear about Amtrak's auto train and quite the run it was having. Very early this morning, the southbound PO53 would strike a semi-truck in the Carolinas, damaging both lead P40s but not derailing anything. Since the nearby PO97 had two good motors, they took the leader off of him and put it on the head of Auto Train, and it just so happened that that engine was Amtrak 164. After everything was figured out and back on the move, Auto Train would have a very rare 4-engine lash-up led by an even more rare Heritage unit and a total of 5 hours late. Since we were only an hour or so drive from the A-Line, we'd make the decision here to head over there to catch the southbound novelty. Coming back into Wildwood, we'd still have a couple hours to play with before we'd have to head east towards the Sanford sub, so we'd find whatever we could before departing. Setting up at the south end of the yard, we'd catch up to M453, stopped on track 1 here, setting off the bad order car in the yard. As the train neared the yard here, the JA dispatcher would notify the train of their defect, which would give us time to catch up to them, as they'd continue from Oxford to the yard at a sluggish 10 miles per hour. The defective car would be the third empty gondola in front of the consist, having what sounded like a jammed brake or a bent axle. Either way, that's a recipe for derailment, or worse, so the crew would go ahead and drop the gondola here, where work trucks and their mechanics could have the car fixed in just a couple of days. That being said, this would be 453's only work to do in Wildwood today, resulting in a quick drop-off operation before backing back onto their train. With 453 now back on his train and building up air pressure, we'd head down the way about 5 miles to Coleman, where the double track singles up. Setting up at Warm Springs Avenue, we'd await the train for a shot at speed as 453 took off for Lakeland, where the Miami crew will get on and take over. Standing here in the weeds at Coleman, it hit me how nice of a day it was. Sure, it's not cool per se, but the dry, low humidity mixed with the scattered cloud coverage would make for a very pleasant day to be outside, and a sign of the cool weather to come in the next few months.
Coleman, track number 1 is a single main.
With 453 gone with the wind, we turn our wheel east towards DeLeon and the A-line. This would be new territory for both me and Dakota, as we took a plethora of back roads across the state to reach the Sanford Sub. It's just before 3 p.m. now, and we're set up and waiting at DeLeon Springs around milepost A742. Here at DeLeon, the speed limit drops to 70 as the tracks curve south towards DeLand and the CFRC that starts there at the station. Here at Ponce de Leon Boulevard, the Ponce de Leon Springs Park entrance awaits visitors with their old cracker-style restaurants and settlement recreations serving as real-life history lessons in the beautiful park that surrounds the natural springs here. Stemming from the St. Johns River, the springs and access to the river is what brought settlers here and the railroad in the first place over a century ago. Now in 2024, the closest stop is 8 miles south at DeLand, where Sunrail service begins. At 3 p.m. on the dot, our train of the day would round the corner with a full head of steam running track speed with the 4-engine lash-up as advertised. We'd grab a late lunch in DeLand and head back west towards the S-Line in Wildwood when more traffic would be pulling in when we'd show up. Beating the train to Moreland Park, we'd see M452 backing a cut of rock into the north yard lead here. By now it was already past 5 p.m., so a bit late for 452 to be seen here, but considering he had a delayed departure from Hialeah the night prior, I guess it checks out. Reminiscent of his southbound counterpart train, M453, 452 would only have a drop-off today at Wildwood, consisting of a couple dozen rock hoppers placed in Track 3. Since the locals from here don't work on weekends, the small yard would be almost totally filled, leaving only one open track here since 453 had completed his duties. Breaking off for gas, we'd return with 452, as the crew would back their two 6-axle GE motors back onto their train for departure. Trains like this have to rebuild air pressure prior to their departure, so we'd head north from here to look for a shot where we'd get 452 at speed. Settling on a spot at the railroad calls Dallas, the setting sun and open shot here would make for a good backdrop as 452 departed Wildwood. The parallel US 301 makes for an easy access, although beware, each time we drove through here today, there'd be a couple of police cars in position to nab anyone speeding on this straight double-lane highway. 452 would have no issue with them though, as he'd take his time reaching the 60-mile-per-hour speed limit on this stretch, passing us at cruising speed. 30 minutes pass and we're staring at a limited clear signal at Coleman. The red over flashing green aspect tells a train to proceed at limited speed, 45 miles per hour, until your entire train is past the switch. This indication is for northbound I-044 from Tampa, who's lined onto track 2 here to meet a couple southbounds here in the Wildwood double track. In the last few minutes of daylight, 44 would show his face, screaming north with Tropicana juice and intermodal for Jacksonville, led solo by one of CSX's rebuilt CM44s. With our last little bit of daylight gone now, we pull south to Bushnell where a high green would be lit for M603, southbound freight from Waycross to Lakeland. Just a few years ago, this train was a midnight or later train through here, right up to when it was abolished. Then it came back for a little bit earlier this year, and was abolished in July for a couple weeks, and now is back to its normal evening schedule, rolling through downtown Bushnell at 8:21 p.m. this Saturday night. Another hour passes and the last train of the night shows up, calling us I-145, a Saturday UPS-less version of I-045, intermodal for Tampa. Not the best shot in Bushnell, to be honest, so we'd try again at Dade City, where 45 would be rolling with no train in its path, high greens all the way to Tampa. This would wrap up our full day out, pretty successful if you ask me, from the S line to DeLeon and back. Just a few weeks before, we'd do a similar route, sticking to the S-line on this trip, and whatever would come our way. Oddly enough, it wouldn't be the power or lash-ups that would make today interesting, but actually the equipment we'd see along the way. Driving east on State Road 56, we'd be hearing bits and pieces on the radio of something out there, and pulling up to Vitus, the gates would be going down for a northbound not 30 seconds after we pulled in. It's around 1 p.m. this day, and the normal time for train M452 to go through. Nothing special on him today, but we wanted to head north anyways, so we'd follow the 452 up towards Dade City, where we'd get our first little bit of pacing action of the day. Pulling into Lacoochee ahead of the train, weeds and grass are now taking over the regulated ballast that used to host the south end of Lacoochee's siding, still guarded by a standard 2-head safe train signal, still operational without its tracks for over 6 months. The entire siding isn't useless, however, but we'll get back to that later in the day. At the north end of the siding, closer to downtown Lacoochee, a curious sign now resides on State Road 575, with a quasi-horn curfew. Not sure if this has been implemented yet or not, as there's no signs along the tracks for crews to see, then again most of their stuff is automated now too. This is a fairly new installment, so I'll make sure I'll keep y'all posted if I'm back here within those hours. As many of you know by now, the M604 and M603 pair's time slot is very favorable to rail fans in the area now, with the 603 being a late evening train and the 604 northbound being a late afternoon run. On this day, we get our first taste of this, setting up in the wild brush that parallels the tracks in Lacoochee, as 604 would round the bend just before 3 p.m. this day. From Lacoochee, we'd have plans to pace the 604 up through St. Catherine and Bushnell, which would end up working out perfectly. I know I made a video in late spring this year of pacing a train here, but it really never gets old. Open roads, friendly crews, and a good focused driver are all you need to do this successfully, and more importantly, safely. Pulling into the north end of Bushnell siding, we catch 604 one last time, speeding north with an agenda today, beating the southbound parade to Stark in the beginning of the North Florida S-Line double track. Back into Bushnell we'd go after hearing the 604 meeting a train at Summerfield. Even though the shots here can get old after a few times, the overall vibe of this town is perfect for a lazy fall afternoon. The positioning of the town's government buildings and office space really shows how even decades after its construction, the town was built around this main line. M453 would be the train in question, heading south set to meet another train at Dade City. Two more GE wide cabs would power this train south today, with the usual consist for Miami and racks for Palm Center, a scene so mundane yet so satisfying too. Moving south from downtown, we'd pick a spot just a couple miles south for our next train. Off US 301 near the distant to Bushnell ABS signal is Coleman Foods, an industry worked about every other day by the Wildwood local, numbered L753. Today, a good amount of grain and animal feed filled hoppers would be spotted here, which is their business, loading their product onto trucks for distribution to the multitude of local farms in the area. Our northbound calling signals in the distance would be B207, unit phosphate out of the Bone Valley for points north near Chicago. Of all the unit trains this line sees, I feel like phosphates are the most elusive when I go out, so to see one here would be a welcome sight, even without any foreign power. From Bushnell, we'd haul down 301 back to Lacoochee, where quite the operation would be taking place. Hearing the dispatcher talk about Lorem Railgrinders coming up the line from Dade City, we'd beat it to Lacoochee, the next control point north. Here, the Railgrinders would be coming north and using what's left of the siding to get out of the way of a few mainline freights. We've established the state of this once through siding, so to see anything running on what's left of it is not only rare, but an improbable scenario for us. So at the once south end of the siding, we'd set up and only wait a few moments as the pair of rail grinders round the ACL to SAL curve at Owensboro. Now at the north end, CS6 foreman would be in position to guide the equipment into the siding and off the main. Remember, these grinders are simply contracted by CSX, including the crews that work them, so anything usually done by a CSX employee is now the responsibility of a foreman, who'd be throwing switches for the lower M crew. With the switch now in hand throw mode and permission past the stop by the JA dispatcher, the grinders would crawl their way into the siding and out of sight on the old Cal Main spur that once served a giant feed mill here and elevator years ago. With derails once again in place and switch back under dispatcher control, the main line would be reopened, with M603 being our first customer, arriving right at twilight. A YN2 AC44 would lead this guy south tonight with a healthy train of Lakeland-bound merchandise with more freight right on its marker lights. Just 10 minutes behind the 603 and running on everything but clears would come L743. We try a shot at the south end of the siding, a bit dark in my opinion, but another train either way. 743 would be all rock today, now a common sight considering the purpose of the train just ahead of him. After meeting the 743 at Lumberton, north would come IO44, routed with an approach limited in the distance on track 1. This indication is preparing 44 to go into the next siding north of here at Dade City to crew stop for his southbound counterpart, I-145.
Well, a little update, folks. It has been about 25 minutes since I got that green signal shot, and 45, or 145 I should say, they're still doing their crew swap in Dade City with 44, and it's taken long enough that now I-178 northbound is in the picture. So he's coming up from Auburndale right now. I think he's about to go through Lakeland, but they're going to meet him here in the double track. This approach medium pretty much tells us that 145 is lined up to Lumberton, which is the south end of that double track, and he'll be stopping there, waiting for that 178 to get by to continue south towards Tampa.
Led by another YN2, 145 would be coming to a stop at Lumberton as expected, but would only have to wait a couple minutes as I-178 would be knocking on the door in just moments. Still lined on track 2, 178 would be rolling north, finishing up the parade of trains this evening and our outing in video as a whole. I thank you all for watching this one. I really appreciate when you guys tune in and comment. It makes all the editing and hours put in worth it. But until we meet again sometime soon out there trackside, this is Christian from Multicolor Films. End of transmission.